Israel, here again for Hebrew in Israel. Thank you for joining me. And this is a long-awaited and highly requested video about how to work with the rabbinic sidur. It's a bit of a strange question I get all the time. I think it's strange because I think these sidurim are pretty self-explanatory, but apparently there are a lot of details which people feel are not clear enough. And I want to make sure that they are. Though you can buy a sidur with full explanations, there is a lot to go through, and apparently not everything is 100% clear. Now, I'm saying this a bit sarcastically because, again, I grew up using the sidur from a very, very young age, and we were told how to use them. So it felt a little kind of arbitrary to me that this is something that people need, but apparently it is. So I am more than happy to help with this. So please don't misunderstand what I said in the beginning. It was a very interesting thing I was asked to do, and I decided eventually to do it. The sidur I'm using here, and hopefully it's okay that I am, because it is possible that I get a strike for using this scan. But this is the Art Scroll Sidur. I am not a fan of the Art Scroll Sidur. I think that their font is not very comfortable, and some of the translations that they do, we'll cover them in a moment, are a little bit weird. I mean, very particular things that they did. Other things we can discuss if it's correct or incorrect. But the reason I picked this one is because it's bilingual. And on the right you have the Hebrew, and there are some references, comments on what has to be done. There's commentary on the bottom, which I think is absolutely phenomenal that they did this. There is an Israeli sidur that does the same thing, Rinat Israel. They did the same thing. There's commentary on the bottom to clarify things. And what we're going to do today is just go through all the sections of sidur, what you do need to say, what you don't need to say. I'm not going to read out the sidur. It's going to be that will take the video. This will be a 2-hour video if I do that, because you have to read everything and then translate. I'm not going to do it. You have the translation on the other side of the page. You can just follow that. And there are sections which I'll go a little bit faster. You can buy an Art Scroll sidur pretty much anywhere. They're online. I prefer other ones, and I use the Koren sidur. I think their font is much nicer. Koren is also the staple in the what I would call the modern Orthodox, the Zionist Orthodox world that I come from, and the font is just much more comfortable. We just grew up using it. It was just this was the thing that we used when I was a kid, and we all got used to it. But the Art Scroll is more the American style, but you can buy Koren online as well. Just go to the Koren website. Don't order off of Amazon or anything. Just go to Koren. They have an English site and so on. But a very, very quick review about the types of sidurim. I do want to make a video about the sidur and overall the development of the sidur. This has been requested as well, and I will do it. The history of the sidurs. I will probably talk about the ancient prayer books that we can find, prayer in biblical times, and this may actually end up being a several-part teaching. Not as a video, as a podcast, but I think people will be very, very interested in it. I did have to go out and purchase books that I could not get PDFs of or couldn't get them from the library. Also, I took courses. I took a course about Second Temple Judaism and Roman Byzantine Judaism. So these are also things that I studied as part of my bachelor's degree. This is going to be based on actual real material that I studied, that was tested about, and also books and material that I purchased. So this is why, the Patreon is a big blessing, because it allows me to go out and purchase things if I can't get them off of the university library. And just very, very quickly, there are 4 types of sidurim, really 4 types that exist out there. There's the Ashkenaz, which is the Central German, Central French, Old Ashkenaz sidur. There were a lot of different versions before the one we use today. It's used amongst Ashkenaz Jews, and you basically it's a sidur that reflects the Ashkenaz tradition. Even though the differences between all the sidurim is not that great, most of the sidurim are based on the Babylonian practice. The sidur from the land of Israel was slightly different. We actually have variations of this, and I'm going to talk about it very, very quickly soon. You have Ashkenaz, that's European, German, Western Europe. You have Sepharad. Sephardi is actually the latest comer within this sequence, but it's a type of Ashkenaz Siddur that developed in Eastern Europe. It's very similar to the Ashkenaz, but it has some changes that happened, changes that were made based on the Sephardic Siddur. This has to do with the rise of Kabbalah, the rise of the Hasidic movement, the rise of the Sephardic traditions amongst Ashkenaz Jews as well, with the spread of Kabbalah. And this is why they moved certain things around. It's still pretty much the same version. The Sfard is closely related to the Chabad. Chabad is what they call Nusach HaArizal, the version of the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Has its own things within it as well, but they're very, very similar. It's still an Ashkenaz Siddur with some Hasidic changes. We have the Sfaradi, which is basically Spanish, Portuguese, and then its other variations like the Moroccan and North African Siddur. But a real Spanish-Portuguese Siddur is different. And Koren actually went out, and I really appreciate that they did this. They actually created two versions of Sfaradi. One is Spanish-Portuguese, what's called Kilat Kodesh Sfaradim, and then there's Sfaradi, which is basically North African and technically Eastern. There's also Eidot HaMizrach. This is for Jews who Syrian, Iraqi, Persian, and so on. But even in all these different groups, originally their Siddurim were a little bit different. And we have to understand that Siddurim were somewhat regional. And then there's also the Yemenite Siddur. The Yemenite Siddur, there are two types, the Shami and Baladi. Baladi being the older one, the original one used in Yemen. But with the appearance of Kabbalah and the move of certain Sephardic Jews and Eastern Jews from Iraq and from Israel or from Syria into Yemen about 350 years ago, they introduced a slightly different variation. And then somewhere around the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a response to the rise of Kabbalah in Yemen, and then you had the Dardaim, which objected to the Kabbalah, so they stuck to their old Baladi version. Baladi comes from the Arabic Balad, land. Shami is the above, the there, the heavens. And so today in Yemen, Yemenite Siddurim are divided up into two different groups. But again, all these Siddurim all are descendants of the same Siddur, or the same Siddurim that came from Babylon. In the what's called the Romanati tradition, the tradition apparently my family comes from, the Romanati, which is Greek Jews and even Italian Jews, some of the Syrians, some of the Egyptians, and even Jews who end up even in Bulgaria and Romania, where my family eventually ended up in Romania, but they never joined the Ashkenaz Jews. They kind of split up, I think, between the Romanati, which had been there in southern Romania from the Roman times, and the Sephardic Jews. There's a very interesting thing what happened with a lot of Jews. There are people who identify as Ashkenaz, but they're actually from Sephardic descent and so on. It's a really, really interesting piece of history. My family is part of that really interesting history. It's not that straightforward as most people think. My grandfather had Sephardic Siddurim, Spanish-Portuguese Siddurim, that he kept in his house. And this was his original Siddur. So it seems to be that at least that branch of my family decided to join the Sephardic, the real Sfaradim, the Spanish Jews of Romania. And only when they came to England, because the Ashkenaz were so powerful there was a decision to kind of go to the Ashkenaz synagogue, even though our practices were not really Ashkenaz. One of the interesting things, like for example, we ate lentils and kitniot, legumes and rice on Passover. So it was very obvious to us we weren't Ashkenaz, but there was a whole thing that was kind of scary for people to identify who they really were back then, because there was a whole political thing. It's a weird story, maybe some other time, but there are plenty of people like me that you discover that they come from, their families are from European countries, but they really came from other areas. Today there's also a thing called Sidur Eretz Israel. It's a Siddur that was introduced by a friend of mine called Yair Shaki. He's actually Yemenite, from all groups that can exist, but he did a lot of research together with Rabbi David Bar Chaim from Jerusalem, and they came up with a Siddur that I used to have the original version of the Siddur that he gave to me, and I lost it for some reason. I'm not too sure where it went to, but he reprinted them, and then a few other friends of mine decided to work together with Yair on this, and today there's a thing called Sidur Eretz Israel. I don't think there is an English version of this, but it's a Siddur completely written in Hebrew. There is no Aramaic. In the Siddur from the East, the Siddur that influenced all the Siddurim of today, there is Aramaic, specifically the Kaddish, while in the land of Israel, the claim that Rabbi Abel Chaim made was that the Kaddish in the land of Israel was actually said in Hebrew, not Aramaic. So it's a very, very interesting thing. The Kaddish, by the way, is used as an interval between different sections of the prayer. It's really not necessary there, but apparently it was something that was done. So people people didn't really speak Hebrew were able to kind of understand what's going on. So the Siddur itself encompasses lots of different sections. Today we're just going to talk about the Siddur for Shacharit, for the morning prayer. Mincha is pretty much like the morning prayer, but not completely, because you don't just say everything. You just say Psalm 145, and then the Amidah, and then there's Tachanun. We'll explain what that is. And in most traditions, Aleinu L'Shabach. In Yemen, in the Baladi, they don't say Aleinu L'Shabach. But in any case, the whole situation here is that there is a whole slew of information here that I can kind of basically cover, but unfortunately we do need to understand that there are so many things that raise questions about what to say, what not to say, and so on. So, unfortunately, I have to take a moment here. Okay. When you have multiple computers that sit around you, they start making noises and so on. Okay. So, all these Siddurim are pretty much the same thing. So what you're going to see here is going to be pretty much the same thing in other places as well. The Siddur does begin with Modeh Ani and different type of things that are said when you wake up. That's not really part of the Siddur. These are much later traditions that developed in especially in Ashkenaz. The old Siddurim, the ones that we find from medieval times, from 10th century and so on, don't even start from there. They actually start from Elohai Neshama. This is a proclamation. My God, the soul you placed within me is pure, and so on. This is some kind of an understanding that the soul kind of leaves the body and then comes back. This does reflect some developments within Jewish beliefs of the time, and and there's not really much you can do about it. This is just how it. This is just does reflect some of the latter developments within Jewish ideas. So this is like a proclamation that you say. Today, most people say this after they wash their hands. You're supposed to wash your hands after you wake up, because people used to go to sleep naked, so your hands touch a lot of things, and you want to use your hands when they're clean. In a lot of places, people used to actually go to the mikveh before they do anything else, because they equate prayer with temple service, even though there really is not a lot of connection there. There are some places in Talmud it mentions some kind of a connection. The prayers were parallel to the sacrifices, but in truth, I'm not too sure that's really how people perceived it. There is some discrepancies between different sections and different sources. Prayer was only supposed to be in Jerusalem, but people did pray when the temple stood, so it's not very clear if there's really a connection there. But eventually, to kind of create some kind of a sense of memory of the temple, probably that concept of the prayers are parallel to the temple service is how people kind of perceive these things. And yes, it's true, the times of our prayers, first thing in the morning and then towards sunset, does parallel the sacrifices, but most people prayed at home, so this may have actually been originally something that people did privately, and the Siddur didn't really exist. Prayer was very freestyle, very freehand, and they may have been public prayers, like for example in the tractate of Ta'anit we see very particular prayers that people would say in public, and that's probably some of the basis of the prayer. It was only groups that really ideologically broke off from the temple that turned the prayer into the center of everything. We need to kind of talk about that in another setting, but we do find prayers, special prayers used in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's different prayer scrolls that we know of and so on, but prayer was mostly something people did naturally. So prayer usually reflected what people needed, and then as a public prayer, you had something maybe somewhat kind of like the idea of a siddur, but there's no way of knowing this for sure. The earliest copy of a siddur that we have is the 18 benedictions, which includes a curse to the early Christians when they eventually broke off from the Jewish world. This is from the 2nd century, so it must be after Bar Kochva, because Bar Kochva is when the split actually finalized. and but that's only the 18 benedictions. We don't have the rest of the prayer book. We have hints, like for example, reciting the Psalms that we'll see later on. That's based on something that's mentioned in the Talmud. That anyone who says the Hallel every day, this is in the Tractate of Brachot. Anyone who says the Hallel every day, is it Brachot or is it Shabbat? One of them. Anyone who says the Hallel every day, then they have a part of the world to come, and then people, the Talmud says, but he reads the Hallel every day is like making fun of God. So there's no, I mean the Hallel, it's the Psalm 145 to Psalm 150. And then other things develop, like for example, reading the Song on the Sea, or the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, and then eventually some places did one thing, some places did the other thing, some places did both. It also happened as well, but eventually everything kind of, all the different sidurim, all the different different sidurim that developed in Europe, especially we have all these manuscripts from Europe that contain these very unique sidurim, very unique versions of the prayer, but they all are descendants of this what's called the Siddur of Saadia and Siddur of Rav Amram. These are the two sidurim that were written in the 10th and 11th centuries, which basically gave the basis of the sidurim that we have today, but they're based on traditions that they had in Babylon. In the land of Israel, it was different. It was a different siddur, and maybe I'll do a special video just about the siddur from the land of Israel. So the next thing, so you actually really start your siddur from, there's like blessings over reading the Torah and things like that, but you don't really have to say those. Because, for example, reading from the Torah, if you say Ahavat Olam or Ahava Rabbah, depends on the version that you have, just before the Shema, it's like saying those blessings before reading the Torah. Originally, people said the blessings over reading the Torah, that you can see prior to this section in your siddur, these were actually read out in the Bet Midrash before people sat down to study. So essentially, when you sit down and study Torah, you're supposed to say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddishanu tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Or whatever other version exists out there. I grew up with the la'asok. I think that's also the one they use in the land of Israel. And then that was really the base blessing that you had to say, and that was it. Every time you sat down, you said a blessing to study Torah. So the next thing you say is a whole bunch of benedictions have to do with function, day and night. Did not make me into a Gentile. By the way, I think that they're in the land of Israel. They didn't say that. They said Shelo asani bur or something. Has not made me a foolish person. That has not made me an ignoramus. Shelo asani aved. It's because of halacha. The difference between a free man and a servant is different. Shelo asani isha. Make me a man, a woman. Basically saying made me a man. I think in some places it didn't say this one. They had a different version that made me into a human or something like that. I can't remember exactly. This was some development later on, I think. Who gives the sight to the blind, clothes the naked, releases the bound, straightens the bent, things like that, enables us to see, enables us to move around, enables us to stand. There's who spreads out the earth upon the waters. This is about actually being able to walk on ground, that the world is safe, who provides me all my needs, firms man's footsteps, and so on. You can just read all of these. There were other versions, as I said, and then you say, basically go through all these. These are you're supposed to say every day, these specific blessings. Then, really in truth, there's a pre-prayer. So what happened was eventually people started equating certain practices, like for example reading from descriptions of the sacrifices and so on. They incorporated them into the prayers. So now we get these medieval prayers, very early medieval prayers that some of them we have variations of them in 8th, 9th centuries, where there's a lot of beseeching God, begging Him for forgiveness, and so on. There is this notion of like we are in exile and therefore we have to beg for forgiveness, and you can see it in the words. But we are your people, members of your covenant, children of Abraham. Aval anachnu ammicha bnei veritecha, bnei Avraham oavecha nishbata lo behar Moriah, and so on, reminding of Abraham, Isaac, and so on, because there's this plead here: please accept us, please listen to us, and so on. And this section, you can skip this, by the way. This entire section here you can completely skip. No, you don't have to say it. And this is why it's not really done as part of the prayer. It's usually read quietly. People usually start it off even before. I think in some places, like the Sephardic synagogues and Chabad, they read this. It's kind of like partially official, but not completely. The real prayer, everything really starts a little bit later. So you have this, and then you read this first variation of the Shema. You're supposed to like think like, I'm not reading this to recite the Shema right now, but I won't be surprised if this was done originally because people were concerned that maybe they will be disrupted in the middle, or they won't always get to the end of things. They have to get up and do something. So there was this very old practice that's actually mentioned in the Mishnah where people would recite the Shema before they start their daily work or as they are working. So they wouldn't say everything within their prayers. They would only recite the Shema and then say the Amidah. What's called the Shema, even though it should be just called Amidah, the prayer you say in standing. So I think this is a result of this mentioning in the Mishnah where it says that a worker recites the Shema and then goes ahead and says the Amidah. So this was a way of making sure you recite the Shema on time, because according to the base law, you're supposed to recite the Shema when light begins and you can recognize someone from a distance. This is something in the Mishnah. And then before sunrise. So sometimes the situation is that you won't be able to recite it before sunrise, so you recite it separately from the prayer, maybe because you don't have the entire minyan, which is 10 free men that pray together, or maybe you're going to have to travel or something. There's lots of different reasons, and I think this is why they inserted this in. And then there's a lot of these like prayers, benedictions, and so on, quotes from different places. It does mention your congregation says Amen, but this is actually never really done because no one really does this in public. This is mostly recited by yourself. There's a reading here of sources from the Mishnah, from the Braita, and so on, of descriptions about the sacrifices. And this is out of an attitude that says we can, V'nishlema parim sefatenu, it's from Isaiah, may our lips complete the oxen, even though there's another place where the Greek says fruit of our lips, because parim, perot, they look very similar, so there may have been a difference there in how they spelled things. One scribe saw one thing, another scribe saw another thing, and they came up with two different variations, even though parim makes a lot more sense. Nishlema parim sefatenu, that our lips will complete the sacrifices. So there's this understanding that if you recite the verses of the sacrifices, it's as if you've done the sacrifices, even though from a theological point of view of an Israelite, this may have not actually been something. It's just a way of filling in gaps that existed because the Second Temple was destroyed. So you have all these descriptions, all these study things as well. And when you finish, there's a thing called Kaddish de Rabbanan. The Kaddish de Rabbanan is completely misused in every sidur in existence. The Kaddish de Rabbanan, there's two different variations of it. The Yemenites have this very, very, it's called Kaddish de Hu'atid. It's a very, very long thing, but it's actually a prayer for the teachers. Rabbanan being Rabbanim, teachers, rabbis. So this was a prayer for the rabbis to protect them. This is supposed to be at the end of the study. The rabbi is supposed to teach in the synagogue, and because not everyone had the opportunity to sit down in synagogue and study, they also inserted all these sections from the Mishnah and so on. No Talmud because it's too complicated, but sections from the Mishnah and the Braita and the Tosefta. These are all Mishnaic style type of texts that allow people to study if they're not going to be able to study throughout the day. So the Kaddish de Rabbanan is really more about the rabbis. So it starts off like a regular Kaddish, and it's mostly Aramaic, even though it looks some of it looks like a Hebrew. And it says, Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Talmudehon ve'al kol Talmidei Talmidehon ve'al kol man de'askin be'oraita di ve'atra haden ve'di ve'chol atar ve'atar. So how it is upon Israel, upon the teachers, their disciples, and all their disciples, and upon all those who engage in the study of Torah who are in this place or anywhere else. Okay, this is the whole idea. This is a prayer in a celebration of the people who study and teach. This is what it all really is. There's also the Kaddish itself starts off with the idea of praising God and so on. The Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, is something that developed in Europe somewhere, I think, around the 10th century, 11th centuries. I can't remember exactly when. I read about this years ago, so it's a miracle I even remember any of this information. But there was a professor called Israel Tashema who wrote about this. I don't know if it's in Hebrew. I had the privilege of meeting his grandson, which was quite amazing. When I mentioned to his grandson that I asked him, I walked down and said, "Are you related to Israel Tachanun?" I said, "Yes, of course I am. That's my grandfather." He was over the moon because he never really, people don't identify. I said, "How not? This is a man who established some of the most important discussions about how to understand Ashkenaz Jewry." I thought his books were phenomenal. Made his day. I was very happy I was able to make that man happy. So the mourners Kaddish was developed as a way to allow the mourners to have some kind of a part in the synagogue and something they could recite as a prayer and so on. But the mourners Kaddish is a much later development. It's connected to some stories that appear about Rabbi Akiva, and it's inserted really in very, very particular places within the prayers, but it has no actual real function in the old Siddurim. So we can say it's more of a latter development. It's a latter thing that was introduced into the prayer book. Things really truly begin from this section onwards. Now this is, if I'm not mistaken, an Ashkenaz. But what we have here in the Ashkenaz Siddur is we have Psalm 30, Mizmor Shir Chanukat HaBayit LeDavid, and immediately after it, the mourners say a Kaddish to get them involved in the prayers and so on. But this is just, again, another way of you say the Kaddish after you do a study. The whole idea of the Kaddish is to say something, a prayer after you study. So there's just no there's no need to really insert this here unless you're just in a study. So this is why we read Psalm 30, because it allows us to say, oh, we just studied something as well, and then you jump into a Kaddish. So there's a bit of something kind of silly about this. This Kaddish is usually much shorter. And as you can see, by the way, there's a note here from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippurim. You say le'ila u'le'ila mikol. Okay? The whole idea here is that this is some kind of another version of the Kaddish, and it became customary to say during this time of year. It has no actual effect on the meaning. It's just more words. And then, basically what happens is, in the Ashkenaz Siddur, the Yemenite Siddur, the old Siddur from the land of Israel, the Romanati, and the Italian Siddur, if I remember correctly, you start from Baruch She'amar. Blessed is he who spoke. In the Sephardic Siddurim, there's a whole collection of psalms, not psalms, but verses, and then a psalm before you recite this. In the Ashkenaz, it's flipped. So you first have Baruch She'amar, and then the verses, and then you go into the psalms. So this is a general blessing, a general statement. Again, contains a podeh u'matzil, redeems and saves and so on. There's a very strong concept here of God the Father who protects, who redeems, who intervenes for his people and so on. You can say the Harini Mezamen, I now prepare my mouth, even though this is more of a Hasidic thing. In Ashkenaz they never said it. In Yemen they never said it. In a lot of groups didn't say it. It's an influence from Kabbalah. They kind of see the speech as being something holy. Unfortunately, these things got into the Ashkenaz Siddur as well. You can say it or not say it. I don't think there's any damage in saying it, but the problem is really what's said here in Aramaic. Leshem Yahud Kucha Berichu Shchinte Al Yedei Hu Tamir V'Ne'elam B'Shem Kol Yisrael. This whole Hu Tamir V'Ne'elam, it really goes into a whole question if you should say it, and there's some theological issues in saying this stuff. The translation is blessed is he and his presence through him who is hidden and inscrutable. It relates to the concept of there's a concept of God that we can see and a concept or discuss, and a concept of God we can't discuss. This is what this whole Kabbalistic thing. There's a thing called the Ein Sof, which is supposed to be something we can't discuss. It's a whole Kabbalistic thing. This is why a lot of Ashkenaz Jews and Romanati and people who come from the older traditions strongly object to this practice, because it relates to concepts that are very esoteric and maybe even problematic from some theological points of view. A Godhead, three heads, it really starts going into places. Kabbalah has a lot of things that you have to be very, very careful with. This is why Chassidut was a big thing, because it mainstreamed Kabbalah, even though to this very day, there are a lot of people from old schools that object to this. So you can read the translation, and then you basically start Hodu. So, Hodu la'Adonai kiru v'shmo, Hodu v'ayim elotav. This is a collection of verses from different places. So it starts off with Chronicles 16, 8 to 36, but then there's a few other places afterwards that there's collections of verses. In the Sephardic Siddur, it starts from this. In the Ashkenaz Siddur, it starts from Baruch She'amar. So this is this. If you want to follow Sephardi, you'll see this first. Okay, and this is a collection of lots of verses. There is a need, by the way, to do a pause here, because you want to make sure that you don't accidentally speak about God as being, Elilim, foreign gods, or nothing. Elil is an interesting thing because it does come from the word El, but if I'm not mistaken, even in biblical Hebrew, there's this concept of Elilim, which means a nothing. So it's a kind of a wordplay. Also, it has the main thing is that in Akkadian it's Illum with two lameds, Illum, and Elilim has the same vowel points as Gelilim, which is manure. So there's a whole wordplay here with this thing, and then you pause and then you say Va'adonai Shamayim Masa. This is actually quite important, and I forgot to mention this. They translate Hashem. If you're praying, you're supposed to say Adonai. Period. And there are Siddurim that objected to this, and they said you have to say Adonai. And then you have verses, bits and pieces from here and there. And then you have the end of this. And usually what happens is a Chazan will say things in the middle, like you saw earlier here. It says, Chazan says out loud or something. He's supposed to say this to make sure everyone knows where he's at, because in the Ashkenaz traditions, these were read out quietly to yourself. In Sephardic synagogues and Yemenite, these are read out loud, so everyone knows where everything is. A good reason to read this out loud is because not everyone had Siddurim, so if someone walks in and doesn't know all the words, they can just listen to the person reading out loud. The Siddur originally there was one Siddur placed on a podium in the synagogue. It was usually a big book chained to the podium because these things were expensive, and a person who could read and write, or at least read out loud to everyone, and this was everywhere, in every group. Eventually, when print came into existence and people started using their own Siddurim, it became very common amongst Ashkenaz Jews to do everything quietly. This is why I have a problem going to Ashkenaz synagogues, because I don't like the mumbling. I rather sit there and read out loud with everyone as a form of praise to God. So that's just me. I think these verses should be read out loud, and not would have intervals where someone reminds you where we're at. By the way, it confuses my kids a lot. They say, where are we now? I don't know, go listen to the guy next to you. I'm reading. This is why I prefer to go. We have several Sephardic synagogues next to us, and it's much more comfortable. Then you read Mizmor LeTodah. This might appear as a menorah within your Siddur. I think it's a beautiful thing. And then you read Yehi Chevod. And this is, in the Sephardic Siddur, this is all of this is before Baruch She'amar. And then in the Ashkenaz, you start Psalm 145, and this goes all the way to the end of the Book of Psalms. In the Sephardic Siddur, there's Baruch She'amar here, and then you go to the Ashrei. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, Baruch She'amar appears here, and after Mizmor LeTodah, you say Yehi Chevod, may the glory of Adonai endure forever, and then you start the Ashrei, and you basically read the Psalms all the way through. So there's no need to really go over this. This is Psalm 145 all the way to 150. And as I said, in some places they read them out loud. In some places they read them quietly, and only the end and beginning are said. And then there's Psalm 150. And then there's like a collection here of verses from a few other places. And then again, a quote from Chronicles, Vayivarech David. Okay, it's a collection of Chronicles 89:53. They did a really nice thing here. They tell you where everything is. The Rinat Yisrael does the same thing, and Chronicles and so on. And then you read through all of this. These are things you have to say, and you go to traditionally today you read the song on the sea, or the song at the sea. I always say Shirat Hayam, song of the sea. That's the one I prefer to say, but it doesn't really matter. As you can see here, the song is in this print. They actually printed the song as it appears in the Torah scroll, where there's spacing between each clause. There are two styles of song. There are two columns, a bi-column system, and then there's a spacing system where it looks like little sections in one large cube. If I'm not mistaken, I think in the Aleppo Codex, even though it used a tri-column system within the text itself, when it comes to Song on the Sea, they broke it up to two columns. So it's a difference in just methodology of writing. So you still read all of this, and you continue on, and there's even a verse in Aramaic. Adonai Melech Haolam Va'ed, Adonai Malchuteh Ka'em La'alam U'Lmei Al-Maya. So La'alam Va'ed is translated very, very lengthy. La'alam U'Lmei Al-Maya. So you do read all of this. This is still things you need to read, and you read Yishtabach. This is the end. This is when everyone prepares to pray together. So a chazan gets up. In the Yemenite synagogue, there's a chazan that kind of starts everything for everyone, and in most synagogues there's a chazan leading everyone. But this is the point where the chazan really takes over. This is the part where there's someone who kind of leads everyone in a much more organized fashion. So the chazan starts Yishtabach. Yemenites read all of this together, by the way. And between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, the 10 days of woe, I don't like the term woe, but the 10 days of woe, you read Shir HaMa'alot. Okay, this is Psalm 130. And then the Chazan reads a Kaddish. And this is where prayer really begins. Now, the way it starts is the Chazan speaks out loud, Baruchu et Adonai HaMevorach. Okay, blessed is Adonai, the blessed one. And the congregation responds, Baruch Adonai HaMevorach le'olam va'ed. Blessed is Adonai, the blessed one for all eternity. And the Chazan says it together with them. Now, depending on the synagogue you're at, this is where you start the blessings of Shema. The first blessing here is actually very reminiscent of stuff that we find from Qumran. It's really a prayer about the rejuvenation of the world, the reintroduction of Genesis every single day into our lives. So this prayer contains a lot of imagery of the sun rising, the earth awakening, and so on. And I actually looked at some of the Qumran prayers, and it's very, very, very similar. Even in some places, exactly the same words. Okay, it was quite phenomenal to see this. So we have this, and it starts, for example, Yotzer Or Vorech Choshech, for example. Yotzer Or Vorech Choshech is a reference to the book of Isaiah, and what's very interesting about the whole thing is that it does reflect the whole concept of light and darkness and sunrise and so on. So you can say all of this, but in some places say, look, because you're supposed to say Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, then you don't read the entire thing. But you can read most of the prayer, and you technically read everything. Now this is for weekdays. Shabbat is a little bit different, but this refers to daily prayer. There's even an acrostic here, El Baruch Gedol De'ah Echinu Fa'al Zarech Chama, uses the alphabet from Aleph to Tav. And eventually what happens is towards the end, there's this section called Kedusha. Okay? You're not supposed to read this if you're by yourself, unless you read this with cantillations, as if you're reading a verse, because this is from the verses. But technically, you're supposed to skip this, and you skip basically all the way to El Baruch, La El Baruch. So you kind of read this section, Kulam Kechad Onim Omrim Bi'irah. But I would even recommend to start for Maritzim Magdishum Mamlichim from this section, glorify, revere, sanctify, and declare, and so on, and then from there, kind of skip. And you basically skip to this section, La'el Baruch Nimot Itenu, to the blessed God they shall offer sweet melodies. Okay? And then you just basically end it. Baruch Atah Adonai Yotzer HaMeorot. There is a debate about Ol Chadash Al Tzion Ta'ir V'Nizchei Kolanu Me'or L'Orot. This is about the Messiah and so on. There are those who object to reading this here because it's not really relevant to the prayer itself. Then we have the prayer about Torah. Now, this, if you read this one, you don't have to say a blessing over Torah study, at least not in the first couple of hours from reading this. But because we get distracted and so on, it's nice to say a blessing over reading Torah every time that you need to study. But here specifically we have two variations. One says Ahavat Olam, that's the most common one, and there's Ahava Rabbah, which is used in Ashkenaz. There was a debate in the Babylonian schools, and they came to this conclusion that maybe in the morning you say Ahavat Olam, and in the evening you say Ahava Rabbah. This is a difference between two different parts of the Jewish culture. There's not much of a difference between Ahavat Olam and Ahava Rabbah. Ahavat Olam is an eternal love. This is abundant love. So there's a difference here. And you basically read the whole thing, and then you recite the Shema. There is a practice to hold the tzitzit in front of you. There were Gaonites who lived in medieval times who objected to this practice. Everyone does it, but there's really no need for it. And you recite Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem, you say quietly to yourself, and then you basically recite Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11, and Numbers 15. And then you read, Ani Adonai Elohim, I am the Lord your God, or I am Adonai your God, and you say the word emet. You attach it to the end of it, and then you go straight. If you're in a congregation, you say Adonai Elohim emet, and you wait for the chazan to finish, or if he's already finished, you carry on. But you want to connect the emet as a testimony that everything that's read is true, and then you carry on v'yatziv. The chazan says out loud, Adonai Elohim emet v'yatziv v'nachon mekayem, etc., etc., etc. You read the entire blessing. Okay, you carry on. There is a tendency to, for example, read out these the ones in bold out loud. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, norati lo tosefele, Adonai imlocha olam va'ed. These are proclamations of the congregation, and then you just say, you read all the way to Baruch atah Adonai ga'al Yisrael. You're supposed to be standing, and when you stand, you start the Amidah. Here, there are little bits and pieces you're supposed to read and pieces you're not supposed to read. First of all, you're supposed to only really read the benedictions. Okay, there's 19 benedictions in the Siddur today. It was originally 18. There's a whole discussion, but there's a benediction against Christians, which is quite important to the history and development of this prayer, but we'll discuss this in another opportunity. And he started with Adonai sefatay tiftach ufi agid tiratech. You say this to yourself. You read this quietly to yourself. If you're by yourself or even in a congregation, if you're a Yemenite synagogue, there is a very good chance they'll recite this out loud in one go, and then there's no repeat. In most synagogues today, they continue the old practice because not everyone knew the prayers, not everyone could read and write, and therefore they would recite quietly, and then they would recite it again out loud for those who don't know. When they redo the second recital of the blessings, then you have the Kedusha, which I'll point out to in a moment. So you read from Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech Eloheinu. Sorry, don't be confused with Eloheinu melech haolam. That's a different blessing. It's a different structure. Eloheinu v'Elohei our God and the God of our fathers. You can read the translation, and you see this little section here. You have Leman Shemo be'ahava, his namesake with love, and then you have this thing here. You only recite this during the days of woe. Now, when you say Baruch atah here and Baruch atah here, you lower yourself, you do the bending. Some people bend their knees and then lower their head. You don't have to, but that's a common practice today. And you say Baruch atah, you lower yourself, and then you say Adonai, and you raise yourself up. Magen Avraham, same thing here. Baruch atah, you lower yourself. Adonai, you raise up. Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu. You only repeat this in 4 places in the entire prayer. 5, let's say. But the rest of it, you don't say. Then you say, Atah gibor la'olam Adonai, mentioning the resurrection of the dead. And again, between winter and non-winter, you have different versions. Meshiv ha'ruach u'morid ha'geshem. Meshiv ha'ruach u'morid ha'tal. It depends where you are. Here they say ha'geshem, because this is a siddur for people who live in the United States. So, in the land of Israel and Babylon, we say Morid Hatal, who brings down dew. The difference here, by the way, Geshem and Gashim, this has to do with a difference in how you read certain words in what's called a pasek form, when you're supposed to stop, and it changes some of the vowel points. But some say Hagashem. You can say Geshem, Gashem, it doesn't really matter. You're saying the same thing anyhow. But there's a difference between the land of Israel and Europe and the United States. The land of Israel, we say Meshiv Hawa Hamuida Tal, he who blows the wind and brings down dew. And in America, in Europe, they say rain. And so on and so forth. And then again, you have the days of woe. And you say, you don't bow or anything. Now, if you're in a congregation of 10, you say Kedusha. There's Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam or Nekdishach Ve'Na'aritzach, depends on which version you have. This is the Ashkenaz. And there are sections where you say, so Nekadesh et Shimcha Ba'olam, Geshem Kedishim Oto B'Shmei Marom, this is technically supposed to be just the Chazan. For some reason, today in Ashkenaz, they said the congregation together, so it's a very noisy situation, even though this is supposed to be an organized orchestra before God. And when you read the verses in Isaiah, it's very clear this is an orchestra. They all say out together, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So, really, in truth, everywhere it says all is what you're supposed to say out loud, and the rest is supposed to be actually the leader of prayer, the Chazan. And you only say this after Mechaya Mitim, only when you recite, when you repeat the prayer for everyone, or if you're reading it out loud together for everyone the one time. Not if you're praying this privately. Now, if you're using Ashkenaz, the third prayer is different because it uses ledol vadol. They use the same words from the end of the Kedusha because they actually turn the Ashkenaz tradition, which is much older, combines the Kedusha and Birkat HaTakadosh. So what happens in Ashkenaz Sidurim, you find these combinations that are actually reminiscent of the old form. So this, for example, is the old form they used from the land of Israel. If I'm not mistaken, in the Siddur used by David Bar Chaim, he actually introduces a prayer very similar to this one, instead of the one we see from the Babylonian tradition. Okay, so if you're in congregation, Ladol Vadol, Nagid Golech, and so on. If you're by yourself, or if you're praying in a Sephardic synagogue, you just go to Atakadosh. Okay? Now, on the days of woe, Ha'el HaKadosh turns into HaMelech HaKadosh, the holy God to the holy king. Okay? And then you basically say each one of the prayers as you progress. Tachanun, insight, repentance, forgiveness, redemption. You just say each one of them. In forgiveness, some people say they hit there over the heart. Selah lanu avinu ki chatanu. If you can hear it, you give a smack over your heart with your fist, gently. Mechal lanu, again mechal, selah mechal. You do a sign of repentance of hitting your chest with your hand. Okay, redemption and so on. Just go through the process. Anenu Adonai Anenu is only said when there is a public fast, and the Chazan says it. For the individual praying by themselves, there's a different section when you say something similar to. Refa'enu for healing, and you can actually hear, you see what this little marker here, you can actually go down and you can mention within your prayer someone you know who's sick. This is for your private prayer. This is not said out loud. This is only said out loud when you read from the Torah. There's a whole thing for what's called a Misha Berach, a blessing for people who are sick. Birkat HaShanim, the blessings of the years, so basically for prosperity, year of prosperity. So if you're during summer, you say Veten Beracha and give a blessing. In the U.S., you actually probably want to say, U.S. and Europe, you actually want to say Veten Talu Matar Livracha and give dew and rain for a blessing, because it depends what the environment is like, what your weather is like, what your agriculture is like. In the land of Israel, we have a seasonal rain. We have seasonal rain. It only rains around very specific times of the year. The rest of the year, it's dry. In Europe and North America and other places as well, it rains constantly. I have friends who make jokes about this in Louisiana, and I have friends who live in Miami. One friend of mine lives in Miami, says, you can tell the time by when the rain comes in around 3:00. Bit of a joke, but something that you have to take into consideration when you're praying where you are. Okay? Then you carry on. You say the blessings as you continue. Again, in restoration of justice, Days of woe, you replace Melech Tzedakah Mishpat, a king who loves righteousness and judgment, with Hamelech HaMishpat, the king of judgment. V'lamalshinim, this is a variation, a very late variation of the prayer against Christians. It was changed eventually because of influence by the church, and also because the prayer kind of morphed into more of a focus on people who are harming the community. So the original said something different, something very harsh towards Christians. Now it's just a curse over people who are enemies of the community. The righteous, which also mentions the Gereh HaTzedek, these are full-blown converts. Okay, you carry on. And the prayer for Jerusalem, prayer about the house of David. In the old Siddur, in the one from the land of Israel, these two prayers were one, and it ended Elohei David Bonei Yerushalayim, the God of David, builder of Jerusalem. Then you have Shema Kolenu. This is the acceptance of prayer. First of all, you can add into this lots of different things, confessions. You can add into this any personal thing that you need to say. Also, should be a section here where you add about fasting. It should be here somewhere in this section. There should be a section here about fasting. Maybe they omitted it from here, but when you have a fast day, you're supposed to add it here as well. I think probably in the version of Mincha they have it for the midday prayer. Then you have Retzeh. During Retzeh, this is about the service of the temple. During feast days, new moon, you add the Ya'aleh v'yavo. May there rise up, arrive, and reach, and so on. You say this, but during the week, you don't say it unless it's a feast or a new moon. V'techezena, and then you reach Modim. Modim, you lower yourself, like in the beginning. Modim, anachnu, and then lach, you raise yourself up. And then in Modim, you have extra sections. Like, for example, during Chanukah and Purim, you add Ala Nisim. When the congregation is reciting this again, the Chazan reads the long Modim, the congregation reads the short Modim. So as the Chazan says, Modim anachnu lach, everyone lowers themselves and rises up. And you're supposed to read Modim in parallel to the Chazan, quietly to yourself. Baruch Ela Odaot, or there's different versions of this as well. There's some versions where it actually says Baruch Ata Adonai Ela Odaot. That's an old version. It's not used anymore. And you also have lots of extra sections here. So you have Ala Nisim for Purim and Chanukah. And you see here in the days of Matityahu, or in the days of Mordechai and Esther. You also have a section here for the days of woe. You only add this during those 10 days, and so on and so forth. And you end and say, Baruch Ata Adonai, Baruch Ata, and then you raise yourself up and say the name. Hatov Shimcha Lecha Na'eh Lehodot. Okay? The beneficent one and you is fitting to give thanks. Now, if you're in a congregation, this is where you say the priestly blessing. If there are no Kohanim, there is a tradition to say that the Chazan says this out loud. Now here they're not showing a priestly blessing because in America, for some reason, and in parts of Europe, they don't do Birkat Kohanim every day. In Israel, depending where you're at, there could be Birkat Kohanim every single day. Sephardic Jews do it every single day. Ashkenaz Jews depends where they're from. In Jerusalem, they say it every day. In Jerusalem, the practice based on the mixture between the Ashkenaz and Sephardic Jews, it became acceptable to say it every day. In other parts of Israel, like for example, where I live up in the north near Haifa, there's a tendency to only do it during Shabbat, and during the week you just skip it. And what the Chazan says is this prayer here, and he recites the priestly blessing, but without, you don't say Amen and so on. I think the old practice used to be to read the whole thing all the way to the end and then say Ken Yehi Ratzon. But today there's this practice, so may it be so, or may it be so, and so on. But this is something, again, I would skip it. If there's no Kohen, I would just carry on. I think that was the old practice. If there's no Kohen, you carry on. Then you have Sim Shalom, establish peace. Again, you have your days of woe. Now, what happens here is you say the section of days of woe. Now, in regular days, you end Hamvarichet Amo Yisrael B'Shalom, he who blesses his people Israel with peace. But during the 10 days of woe, you actually say Oseh HaShalom, he who does peace. And then you say at the end of verse, that's the end of the prayer. Everything that comes after this, all these sections here, this section here, Elohai Netzor Lishonim Mera, and then saying again, Yehi Ratzonim Refi, may the expressions of my mouth, and so on. These are all. This is Psalm 19, verse 15. This is actually a prayer that's mentioned in the Talmud that some rabbi used to say at the end. If you want to incorporate this prayer within your regular prayer, the correct way of doing it, this is something that's mentioned in different sources, is actually don't say the verse from Psalm 19, wait for it, say this prayer, and then say the verse from Psalm 19, and then Oseh Shalom Mimromav. This is, you actually step back, and you Oseh Shalom Mimromav, you turn to your left, which is the one standing in front of you, is that right? Okay. He who makes peace in his highness, that's to your left. May he make peace, you turn to your right, upon us, and then you go to the center, and upon all of Israel, and then the people say Amen. V'imru Amen. That's a mistake. That's just a mistake someone made when they copied the sidur. It's clear this is something that Chazan says out loud, and the congregation is supposed to say Amen. And then there's a Yehi Ratzon, may it be so, that you say a prayer for the rebuilding of the temple. Then what happens here is a thing called Tachanun. Now Avinu Malkeinu is only said during days of woe and so on, so you don't have to say this at all. You can skip all of this. And there is Tachanun here, Vehu Rachum. Again, this is only said on Mondays and Thursdays when we read from the Torah. So you actually skip all of this, and you only read this on Mondays and Thursdays. And the only thing you're supposed to do every day, unless it's a feast day, a new moon, there's a celebration of some sort, you skip all the way to what's called putting down the head. This is literally, people used to lay down on the floor and say this prayer. Sephardic Jews and the Sephardic Siddur, the Nefilat Apayim will appear before all the things that we just skipped. On Mondays and Thursdays, you read the entire section I just skipped here. And then Nefilat Apayim, the Sephardic Siddur, there's a whole section here where you read from Exodus, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, and so on, and there's a whole section there, and then you do the Nefilat Apayim. You do the placing your head to the ground, onto the floor. You read that, and then you read this section here, Adonai, God of Israel, turn back from your flaring, and so on. You read all of this, and then you read Shomer Yisrael, guardian of Israel, and then there's a half Kaddish. This is like an interval. We're done with this section, now we're moving on. Now on Mondays and Thursdays, you have a Torah reading. So in almost all Siddurim, there'll be a Torah reading section here, okay? And that's something you have to kind of like, take out the Torah scroll, and then you read from the Torah scroll and so on. And then after you're done with the Torah scroll, depending on your practice, in some places it will be, the Torah scroll is returned immediately. In some places you wait until after the Ashrei. So you read Psalm 145 again, okay? And you read Lam Natseach, another psalm. You read from Psalm, what is this? What psalm is this? Lam Natseach. I keep on forgetting which psalm this is. Psalm 20. And then you read Uva Letzion. This is a collection. And this is, again, a study thing. There's like reading verses and reading them in Aramaic. So, Isaiah 6. This is basically, again, like the Kedusha and the Amidah, and there's a translation to Aramaic, and so on, and then there's like a bit of reading here, and so on and so forth. And then when you're done with this, you say Kaddish Shalem, a full Kaddish. Now on Mondays and Thursdays, you say all of this only after you read from the Torah. There's a whole ceremony, you read from the book of Numbers, and when the ark traveled, and so on, and then you open the Torah scroll. Sephardic Jews lift the Torah scroll before the reading, Ashkenaz Jews do it after. And then again, depending on what your tradition is, you put the Torah scroll immediately back, or you do it a little bit later. Then you read a full Kaddish. Okay, this is the full version of the Kaddish. And in Ashkenaz and Yemen, this is pretty much where the prayer ends. You say Aleinu L'Shabach. Now, Aleinu L'Shabach is actually something that was taken from the Yom Kippur prayers. And this was incorporated into everyday prayer for some reason at some very, very late stage. There really is no reason to read. There really is no historical reason to read Aleinu Shabach, except for the fact that it's a celebration of saying there's one God. Sephardic Siddurim push this. Sephardic Siddurim push this all the way to the end. So immediately after the Kaddish here, okay, you basically go to the daily song Shir Shel Yom. So if you're doing Ashkenaz, you do it after Aleinu Shabach and all the sections and the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. And in the Sephardic Siddurim, you first of all do Kaddish, then the song of the day and all the readings after this, and only at the end you say another Kaddish and then a Aleinu Shabach. So every day you read the particular day, or Sunday, Monday, and so on. Okay, so you just read these. Each day has its own psalm. Obviously, there won't be Shabbat here because this is a daily prayer. Okay, and this is the end in the Ashkenaz Siddur. In the Sephardic Siddur, you go back. Well, you don't have to go back in the Sephardic Siddur, but this is what will happen. You read that, and then what will happen is immediately after it, there'll be a Kaddish. There'll be a reading of a section, again, about Ktoret, about the incense, about sacrifices, certain statements from the Mishnah and the Braita and so on. You say another Kaddish, what's called the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. You say Aleinu Shabach, another mourner's Kaddish, and that's pretty much it. That's the end of the prayer session for a weekday. Mincha, daily prayer in the afternoon, you say Psalm 150, and you basically do the Amidah and the placing of the face on the floor, and Aleinu Leshabach. And Arvit has its own set, but again, you say two prayers before the Shema, two blessings before the Shema. You also say Barichu, like we do in the morning. You say Barichu, the community responds. You say two blessings, short blessings before. You recite the Shema. You Shema like in the morning. You say the blessing afterwards, and then your Amidah, same rules as in the morning. You say a Kaddish after the evening prayer, and you say Aleinu Shabach, mourner's Kaddish, and you're done. You go home. That's a weekly prayer. Shabbat has very similar rules as well. Your morning starts exactly the same. The only difference is some of your blessings will be focused more on the concept of Shabbat, especially the one that deals with the sunrise, the first blessing before Shema. It focuses on the concept of Shabbat. There's poetry in there, medieval poetry, has to do with Shabbat and the exaltation of Shabbat and so on. And then your Amidah is shorter. It only has 7 benedictions. It has the first 3, the last 3, and in the middle there's a special one for Shabbat. Same thing with Mincha. There's also Musaf. It's a prayer that's said after the Torah reading on Shabbat. Same structure. You say Ashrei, first 3, last 3, and in the middle there's a special one that has to do with the daily sacrifice of Shabbat. And that's pretty much it. That's really, when you do the morning version, the morning service, it kind of covers pretty much everything else because the prayers in Judaism are extremely repetitive. So it's very easy to go through everything else if you understand how the one in the morning works. And just do yourself a favor, maybe if you have difficulty to remember, take a pencil, write down things or mark things up. But these Siddurim, for example, the Art Scroll Siddur is extremely useful as a sidur because they have a lot of notes, a lot of comments, and the translation is okay, but there are places where I would say, especially when they try to refer to, instead of the name, they write God or Hashem and so on. It gets a little bit funny. But other than that, this is basically what you need to know how to use a sidur. I hope you enjoyed this. I appreciate you watching this video, studying with me, and God willing, I will do more videos. Kol Tov.